Beginning in early November of this year, the Oromia region has witnessed a protest movement, the likes of which has not been seen in Ethiopian history. The protests were triggered by a decision to lease a sacred forest area to an investor around Ginchi, a small town west of the federal capital of Addis Ababa. Soon, the protest took on a form of resistance against the federal government's scheme known as the Addis Ababa Integrated Master Plan, but also merged grievances in rural areas with the urban issue of city expansion. In a few days, the protest movement engulfed all of Oromia and involved Oromos from all walks of life. The government responded with strong armed tactics that involved using the country's military against its own people. So far, more than 85 people have been killed, thousands brutalized, and tens of thousands imprisoned. The protests and government crackdown continues. To discuss these issues, we have invited Dr. Tsegaye Ragassa, a constitutional lawyer at the University of Melbourne in Australia, and Henok Gebissa, an international law fellow at Washington and Lee University in Lexington, Virginia. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming. The question is about the human rights and democratic rights. People could oppose the government on policy issues, whether that's the federal government or the local government. Were the demonstrators within their rights to oppose government? Were they exercising their human, constitutional, and democratic rights?
That is absolutely right. Here, what has to be made clear is the right to demonstrate and peacefully protest against any policy that has been made to affect your own life. It is not only within the constitutional boundary, it is a natural and inherent right that has been conferred upon any human being, not by a government or not by a state, but by the supernatural entity that human beings think of as a right that is given naturally. So the Ethiopian constitution that came into being in 1995 does not give the right to protest. It is the right that has been given naturally. I'm not saying that the right does not exist within the constitution. It does exist in a positivist understanding of the law. But what is so fascinating and very interesting about this right to peacefully protest against the policy is that the authorities or governmental authorities are supposed to be notified whenever people protest. The only and primary reason of being notified by the government is for the sake of protecting the people who protest. It's for the sake of arranging logistical issues and facilitating how you protest. It is not a right that is regulated by the government. It's not something that you can protest on this issue and you cannot protest on the other issue. As much as people feel like protesting against any policy, it is within a full boundary of the Constitution and within their naturally given right to protest against the government. But what we are looking at now in Oromia is totally a different level of brutality and killing. It's not only a massacre and murdering of Oromo souls and daughters and sons. Now, in one of my friend's words, Oromia is in a complete war zone, which is administered by a joint responsibility between the command post and the anti-terror task force. Now, this brings the issue of constitutionality of declaration of state of emergency, which was stipulated under Article 93 of the Ethiopian Constitution. As we know it, the OPIDIO, which is a nominal political party or power in Oromia, has been totally overridden and was put out of responsibility with this task. And the Oromia is being administrated by the command post and anti-terror task force. That's why you see all these killings and brutal murdering and collective incarceration and disfiguring of Oromo people. So the question here is there a declaration of state of emergency in Oromia? If it does, but when we see the practice, the real happening on the ground, it looks exactly the same as a declaration of a state of emergency. But for a government of Ethiopia to declare a state of emergency, there is a constitutional procedure That is clearly stipulated under the Constitution of Article 93, which gives the Council of Ministers the power to declare that emergency and also automatically in 24 or 48 hours, I'm not sure about it, to report to the parliament if the parliament is session. Now, you will never see these constitutional acts or juridical acts happening in the last couple of weeks in Oromia. And it just gives you a clear message from the government that people are not only the subject, but also the object, a simple and arbitrary object of the current political arrangement. And this completely nullifies and undermines the legitimacy and representative nature of the current government of the Oromo people. And now what we see in the protest is that it's not only about the master plan. Now it is a question of agency. Does the government really and legitimately represent the Oromo, not only the Oromo, the wider Ethiopian people? That is the question that is on the table now. And in my opinion, the excessive and brutal military force against the Oromo and other parts of Ethiopian people, example in Gondar, clearly conveys a message that the representativeness of this political party is going to be over very soon. And it feels like that the people are guarding and protecting the constitution from the government and from the authority that authors this constitution itself. And that is the most fascinating unfoldings in this scenario that we saw in the last couple of weeks.
Dr. Tsegaye,
yes.
Does the government of Ethiopia, now anyone violating the constitution or the law becomes an outlaw? The constitution refers specifically in these two parts about the protection of citizens against bodily harm and against the use of excessive force. Has the government of Ethiopia become an outlaw?
There is an obvious answer to that, but speaking as a lawyer, we can also give a more complicated answer. The obvious answer is obviously it is an outlaw. In fact, I will go further beyond that it is illegality is constitutive. Because there has never been a time when the Ethiopian government has acted within the bounds of law. And in my other comments and writings, I have long been arguing that in Ethiopia, three things are confused. I mean, or at least this is how I see it. Because there is no rule of law, the men in the uniform never bow to the men in the robes. And the men in the uniform never bow to the men in the suits, and the men in the suits never bow to the men in the robes, which means the politicians do not respect the judges, and the soldiers do not respect the politicians. And there is a reason for that. If you look closely at the situation, our politics has never been disarmed, really. TPLF continues to be TPLF. People who were once in the armed struggle are still politicians and leaders. So the people in the suits are the people in the uniform, really. And the people in the uniform are the people in the suits also, because the military is also a politician, because it's a political army, a liberation army, historically, at least in its constitution. The result of that is the blurring of all these institutions that would normally be kept apart from each other through the principle of separation of powers in the constitution. The result is that in Ethiopia, the politicians never bowed to the principles of rules of law. Law was therefore reduced to a technique of governance, which is used to rationalize government abuses, to justify excessive use of power, and as part of the constellation of ideological practices and discourses presented, for example, to act against the people. And most of the times, these terrorism discourse now unleashed in Ethiopia since 2005, but especially, is that these people protesting the government are basically railing against the constitutional order. So it's very interesting, an interesting travesty of language here, that the the government uses the law only to justify its illegality. And in all other situations, they don't even refer to it. Having said that, this being the simple answer, let me quickly talk about the violations that they have conducted. For example, do people have the right to protest? Absolutely. Article 30 says that people can peaceably, rightfully assemble and demonstrate. They can petition their government. That's what the Constitution says. And the government, of course, as an accountable government, according to Article 12, should have been responsive and responsible to the demands, responsive in the sense that it has to react to the people's demand, and responsible, it must take responsibility for its vices. But that never happened. There is all sorts of other violations, like Henok had just mentioned the issue of declaration of war without even any semblance of legality in the name of the declaration of emergency. Even if there is an emergency law, there is a limit to how the government should conduct itself, even in the state of emergency, even when it has officially, legally, constitutionally, in the parliament declared the existence of an emergency situation. There are 5 major articles of the Constitution that cannot be violated, even in emergency situations. These are the federal nature of the state, which means the self-rule, shared rule, things would continue. What we see now is the complete obliteration of the state autonomy of Oromia, and therefore the undoing of the federal structure of the country. Number 2, even during emergency situations under Article 93, the state cannot suspend or restrict or derogate from the right of nations and nationalities and peoples to self-determination. Sub-Article 1, Article 39, and Sub-Article 2, the right to self-governance, the right to promote one's culture, identity, history, etc., etc. These 2 articles cannot be violated even in the course of implementing an emergency rule. And third right is the right of equality. No one will be discriminated against, even in those circumstances, even in those harsh, difficult circumstances. What we see now, as we have always seen, when I was a student, a federal police stands around your dormitory, asks you for your ID card, looks at your ID card, looks at your name, you have a Ragassa name, and he will point you to the car, to the vehicle that takes students to places of detention. It's always the case. Now, in the same way, anyone who's got an Oromo name is now under security surveillance. And in fact, if anything, there is only discrimination now rather than non-discrimination, even if it was a state of emergency. The last kind of right that cannot be limited, or the last kind of act that can never be done, even in emergency situations, is torture. Enforcement of cruel, unusual, degrading, dehumanizing treatment. And what did we see in this course of things now? Civilians shot in broad daylight, and all sorts of abuses happening. And is this the anomaly? Is this an isolated case? Is this what we are just seeing now? No. The answer is completely in the negative. This has been a pattern, a documented pattern, documented in human rights reports after reports after reports, year after year and after year. Now, this is a pattern. If this cannot make this state an outlaw state, I don't know what does. That said, I would actually go further than this. If really there was a protest movement that is illegal, that is beyond the control of the state government, what would normally happen if that was a country that has an ethical sense of doing politics? If it was a country whose politics is governed by law, by constitutions, is that the state government invites the federal government to intervene. It's called the federal intervention process, to intervene and help to control the protest. So according to the Federal Intervention Law, Proclamation 359, 2003, what would happen is that the Oromo government writes a letter to the House of Federation. The House of Federation orders the federal government, the executive, or specific branch of the executive, like the army, or not the army normally, because the army acts outwardly, actually, the federal police, or the federal security, intelligence, etc., to go down, and usually authorizes the federal prime minister to go down and operate on the land on the invitation of the Oromo government to handle the situation. That didn't happen. It didn't happen in Gambela in 2003. It didn't happen in the South region when Sidama were protesting the relocation from Hawassa to Yirgalem. It didn't happen in Benishangul Gumuz when there was a conflict between the Gumuz, the Berta and the Oromo, the Gumuz, and so on and so forth. It never happened. So federal intervention rule is violated. The state boundary is violated. The state is literally, it doesn't exist. The Oromo government doesn't exist at the moment. And I think right now we are not even in the realm of being governed in an emergency, in a state of emergency. We are in a state of war. And all the symptoms of the regime authorities, all the symptoms indicate that we are really in an act of war, because the federal authorities are speaking in terms of taking a definitive, conclusive measure. We will implement this nilly-willy, etc., etc. That said, one thing comes out as a pattern, because as I said, I do historically inflected jurisprudence, and looking at this scenario now, it only reinforces what has been historically true. It has got a genealogy. The Ethiopian legal regime and the Ethiopian state is constituted not just in neglect of the Oromo and leaving it in the periphery, but in a direct offensive against the Oromo. In fact, I have an argument that the Ethiopian state is defined in its originary moment, defined against the other peoples of Ethiopia. Historically, the Oromo has been presented as the savage. When Ethiopia was a Christian empire, the Oromo was the savage other. When Ethiopia was a socialist, progressive, modern republic, the Oromo was the backward, primitive other, waiting to be developed. During the Christian empire era, the Oromo was the savage other, waiting to be saved, waiting to be civilized. And now, in this era of globalization, when the Ethiopian government presents itself as a very trusted strategic ally of the West, in other words, as a cosmopolitan neoliberal actor, the Oromo is the primordialist, the ethno-nationalist, and the state is the cosmopolitan. They are the ethnic, ethno-nationalist terrorist. This is the pattern. And interestingly, history is important here, discourses are important here, and the government is cashing out this history of othering the Oromo as it campaigns against the Oromo right now in the name of quelling the protest and in the name of implementing what is supposed to be a development plan called the master plan.
Henok, if the Constitution has been scrapped, as was described now, if the federal arrangement has been shelved, what would be the legal context in which other states, other federal units can feel that they are being governed by a constitutional order or a government that has any constitutional legitimacy?
Now, we know that the government is willfully and intentionally undermining the constitution that it authored itself. And also with all the deficiencies, structural flaws, and practical and substantive deficiency of the constitution, the Oromo people are trying to protect and guard the constitution against the author of the constitution, which is ironic. And we see all the killings taking place, and kidnapping and gang raping of Oromo daughters as young as 12 years in the Walaga area are just coming out, and the mass incarceration of the people, of the Oromo people, is just taking place. And what we see is there is a consequence for this. There is both a political consequence and there is a legal consequence for this. More effectively, the political consequence is just being felt by the government, and it's going to feel the consequence. And over the last 25 years, the regime's economic and political activities, which is acutely discriminatory to the Oromo people, have now come into light in a very in the form of mass movement, because the Oromo people have been evaluating for the past couple of decades about this political and economic discrimination. Now is a time where it is a mass galvanization and a mass consciousness and collective meeting of mind among the Oromos to put the government into strict scrutiny. And this peaceful protest or a popular resistance against the regime is a form of expressing their own discontent and grievance against the government. Now the redress is that, number one, what we see the people doing is that they are delegitimizing the power and the authority of the government. And Walaga area, we know that they have been electing, people have been electing their own representatives. And that is a popular redress. When you have a framework that is hostile and offensive to the people, the only available space and redress mechanism is a mass movement that popularly outlaws and tell the government to its face that it is a time for the regime to rethink itself or to leave the political space. And we are at a point where the much acclaimed economic growth, a double-digit economic growth of the government, is not saving the world, or it's not saving the 20 million Ethiopian people who needs emergency food at the moment. And we have a democratic equation in Ethiopia that has been questioned for the last 25 years, both by donor governments and bilateral and multilateral financial institutions, that the democracy does not exist in Ethiopia. Now we see in a broad daylight of Oromo killings and massacre. So this brought two perspectives that Ethiopian government has been selling to the outside world: the economic growth equation, or the economic growth rhetorics or shibboleths, has now gone into the public, demonstrating and clearly in a self-evident manner, telling the world and the Ethiopian people that the growth is not saving the majority from the ongoing drought and famine. Now, what does that tell about the Ethiopian government? What it tells clearly is that the legitimacy, political legitimacy, and the political sovereignty, especially the domestic sovereignty of the government over its own people, is absolutely undermined to the point it will not recover, and to the point where it might be going away forever. So the redress that I see with regard to the Oromo protest is that, given the moral leadership that exists among the Oromo masses and Oromo students, that emanates, or that comes out of all the killings and the ultimate form of self-sacrifice on the street of Oromia, shows that the leadership of the Oromo is time. It's a right time to just emerge now and show that the Oromos are not only responsible for themselves, but they are also in the form of leading a country into a more conscious and a more sustainable and a more harmonized and a real unity that would bring a country that we all would love to call home. That is the point where we are headed now. And finally, the point I would like to make in this regard is that now we've seen for the last 25 the government doing all what it can. And now it's a time to just leave a throne and tell the people that they can be their own representative through their own form of democratic participation. So that is the point I just really want to make, and I just really appreciate this.
Yeah, it's very fascinating that a very interesting point that Henok made regarding the people guarding the constitution against the state. I was recently reflecting on a small piece, an opinion piece I'm writing. The title is very telling. It very much resonates with what you just said. I was saying, saving the state from itself, saving TPLF from itself, saving Ethiopia from itself. And it's a very interesting season now that Ethiopia's ultimate other, the Oromo, are coming back to save Ethiopia from itself. In spite of this crisis, and because of this crisis. And the reason we say that is that it is the opposition, it is the Oromo now, it was the Muslims, it was these young bloggers who were insisting on the terms of the constitution for the governance of that country. And it was the state who was reneging on the terms of the constitution of that country. How do we do redress now? The redress is already coming up in the form of politics. Legal redress is always a function of political redress. The starting point is when we take them to account legally, to take these officials to account legally. But to bring about legal accountability, we have to first do political accountability, and the state must make a political gesture to take responsibility. Easy things are there to be done. Number one, the state should come out and say, we are sorry. They have to deplore the deplorable situation. It is in terms of populism, it's in terms of doing politics that the state officials come out and say, we are sorry. And the first time the prime minister comes out to make a statement, he actually begins with warning and bravado. Sad. So it is a very unrepentant state, I know, but the easy thing to do is to deplore the situation, to extend sympathy to the people who have sustained loss, to apologize for the mistakes and misreading of the public sentiment, and to take responsibility in the form of resignation, wherever necessary, and in the form of taking administrative measures of the people who have done and manifest, public administrative measures of the people who have done some wrongs. Because legal justice and accountability is the function of political accountability, the function of political will that is in place, the function of a state which says, this is a dark moment in our national history. The state does not want to be implicated in this dark moment, in this injustice, and therefore we distance ourselves from it by some form of expiation, by making some people pay for this problem. Resignation, removal, dismissal. The second thing they have to do is to say explicitly that this master plan is frozen. It doesn't exist anymore. How do they do that? The Oromia Chafe had to officially call an emergency meeting and abrogate, repeal the legislation publicly. And second thing, the federal government admit the illegality of the master plan, meaning even if it is probably plausible, it wasn't made in such a way that they are publicly accountable for it. It wasn't discussed in parliament or in the city council or anywhere, and it wasn't given a legal sanction. It is official, but it is not legal, and it is not legally binding. All right? So admit that illegality, and at least to the extent they have done it officially they have to come out and say, this is not going to continue. And thirdly, as I said, the forensic establishment of guilt is important in this process of making the legal accountability possible. In order to do that, they need to establish an inquiry commission, an impartial, neutral inquiry commission that investigates the situation. And fourthly, they should dismiss the Oromia Chafe because just a few months after the declaration of 100% triumph in election, there is a more than 100% rejection of the OPDO as a government in that region. So when you are so much rebuffed and when you are not trusted by the federal government, it's in your interest to call a snap election in a few months' time. Meantime, people have taken power in some places, in Aya Guliso, in Wallaka, for some time in Amaya, in Jaldu, in Woliso, in these different places. These areas, almost in the Occupy movement of the West, they just took over the places, removed the officials, elected their own officials, and they are governing themselves in there. Now, of course, the reprisal will be a dangerous genocidal extermination of the young people of the area, either through killing outright or through concentration camps, putting them in concentration camps. So what we see now is a total rejection of the government, and that government should be dismissed, and it has to be reconstituted if we have to do it. Now, this is a very conservative approach, a very minimalist approach to bring about peace and stability in the country for the purpose of saving EPRDF from itself. I'm not happy with it, of course. It shouldn't be used to calm down and to take the sting out of the revolutionary movement that we are seeing in Oromia, at least, which would help finally to transform the state and to transform the politics through democracy, transform the state through a genuine form of federal dispensation. Now, am I optimistic that that kind of redress would happen? Absolutely not. So what is going to be done? What is going to be done is to keep the flame of the popular movement alive, and to keep pressing the government, and to keep taking power, and to develop for the Oromia people. It's a very important historical juncture now to develop a leadership from within the movement, from the generation that actually said enough is enough, dinne is a motto, from among them to deliver what is going to become the saving of Ethiopia from itself, and ironically by its others, among which is the Oromo, the biggest other of Ethiopia.
On that point of irony, I thank you both for your time. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ezkeil.
Thank you, friends.